So I don't really think I need to tell you what I think of the film or really give an intro other than that. Hi guys, so today clearly we're talking about Oppenheimer. This is a follow-up from my previous videos on Barbenheimer as a phenomenon and then Barbie, and looking at these films a year later. So we're looking at Oppenheimer. This might be a long one. I'm going to start with my personal feelings on the film, some of the aspects that I really enjoy, and then I'm going to go into my broader commentary on Oppenheimer as a figure and the consequences of the actions that the film depicts. So firstly, obviously, I love the film. Clearly, I mean, I bought a steelbook edition of it. You know, like it's obvious I love the film. I mean, between that and the screenplay, which I've annotated, got all these tabs on it. So clearly, I genuinely love the film. Think it is phenomenal. In my opinion, it is Christopher Nolan's best work. I think it's the best amalgamation of all of the things he has attempted. His non-linear storytelling in this is phenomenal. The use of tension is super effective. And also, a thing I think should really be highlighted is the use of black and white to show the different perspectives. I think that is something the film does so well. The colour showing Oppenheimer's more subjective view of things versus the black and white being the more outsider perspective. And that really highlighting the nuances and how this could be so easily viewed multiple ways. I also do think it is important to mention the 3-act structure of the film. The first act acting as like an origin story for Oppenheimer. We see, you know, a young Oppenheimer pursuing quantum mechanics and his obsession with these ideas. Then the second act acts as like, almost feels like a heist film, like that kind of energy of this build up and all this planning and the lead up to the Trinity test. And then from that point onwards we enter a courtroom drama, which is obviously filled with tension, talks about the anti-communist propaganda of the Cold War, which influenced so much at that time, obviously. But yeah, that's like my general thoughts on the film and like the basic things. I mean, yeah, ultimately I just think the film is fantastic. I saw it 3 times in theatres, and then including once in IMAX, and I've seen it, I want to say 3 or 4 times since then, including to write this video. And yeah, every time there are just so many things to unpack, and it just continues. I still just feel so much of it, and like that first viewing of it, like I had such a visceral response in a way that I don't think I've ever had watching something before. And I think that's why I became somewhat obsessed for a while with just going through the motions of it, because I really did just have such an intense response to this film. But so yeah, that's my like general thoughts on the film. It's like there's not a lot for me to really say there other than that I just think in every aspect it's phenomenal. Again, the storytelling and the use of black and white and colour. I mean, it's also a gorgeous film to look at. The cinematography, like the use of the IMAX format, which obviously Christopher Nolan is a real champion for IMAX and is used so well. Getting to see an IMAX, which was my 3rd time seeing it, was such a wild time. Like I really didn't think I would feel any differently at that point. I'd already seen it twice, but truly IMAX was overwhelming for this film. Also, I do want to mention as well, cinematography wise, is that the cut-ins of like what's happening in Oppenheimer's mind and like his like visualizations of like quantum mechanics and those and the reactions and like, yeah, giving like a visual to something that's so abstract and vague, I think did so much for the film. And also, again, really helped with the tension. I think this film, especially in the first half year, and everything before the Trinity test, because we ultimately do know we're going to that point, is so tense, and really it's just something that you can truly feel. Also, obviously the score is phenomenal. I'm gonna get vinyl out again, talk about the score. Obviously I love the score. Let's just look at the vinyl while we're at it. The score is fantastic. Obviously done by Ludwig Göransson, who's done a couple of other Christopher Nolan film soundtracks, including Tenet, I want to say. But yeah, I mean, let's just get distracted by the vinyl and the way this folds out, because honestly, I mean, come on. But anyway, yeah, the score is fantastic. Genuinely, this film would not feel anywhere near as intense as it does without this score. The score of this film is truly, I mean, I have no real words for it. In particular, Can You Hear the Music? I think that's the one that everyone talks about as being like such as like standout in the score. I mean, I remember sitting in the theatre and that sequence kind of being the moment where I was like, oh, this isn't just like a good film, this is something else. I really, and part of that is to do with the score being so incredible in that sequence. Also, I think Quantum Mechanics is a really great piece, a really interesting part of that early stage of the film as well. Also, American Prometheus, which is where we see Oppenheimer donning like his kind of staple uniform as we come to know it at Los Alamos. And I think that's like the piece of music from the score that really is like what the film feels like. That is the all-encompassing one. And then obviously Destroyer of Worlds is the final scene, and that the existential dread I still feel every time I hear Destroyer of Worlds is something else entirely, truly. Also, obviously, I don't really need to tell anyone that the performances in this movie are fantastic. First of all, watching it, it's like every time a new character comes on screen, it's another A-list actor, to a point where it just got a little ridiculous. Like, you'd see someone else and be like, oh my god. Obviously, Cillian Murphy, I think, gives the performance of his life in this film. I mean, clearly he won the Oscar for it for good reason. I think Oppenheimer is such a complicated person to live in the headspace of and to carry this film, because ultimately the whole film rests on Cillian Murphy being great as Oppenheimer, which he did, and it's, yeah, a truly incredible performance from him. I also do want to mention some of my like just favourite scenes of the film. Again, Can You Hear the Music? I think that really shows like the wonder in a young Oppenheimer and this obsession and with these ideas of quantum mechanics and physics, and yeah, him really, he's so clearly just enthralled with these things. And the way that sequence plays out, like I just could, clearly I don't really have words for that one. Also, the Trinity test sequence, sorry, my notes are over here. As always, if I'm looking in a random direction, it's my notes. But yeah, the Trinity test sequence is obviously the best use of tension in the film. It's like, we already know, because the atmosphere wasn't set alight, that like this test will work out and it's not going to kill everyone. But sitting there in that moment during the sequence, you really do feel that fear that like they could set the atmosphere on fire and kill everyone and just destroy the world, and you really feel that so intensely, and that is just a credit to how good this sequence is. Again, the sound in this scene is great, as it is in the whole film, but especially in the scene and its absence. I think especially the moments of silence or quiet are what really make the Trinity test feel so intense. There's also like the feelings I felt after the Trinity test, when they're all celebrating, you know, they all are so elated that the test worked. And I, as a viewer, felt such a simultaneous, like, elation with them, because it's like you are following these characters, you almost want them to succeed because you empathize with their position, but in this, and almost proud of them for achieving this thing. Well, in the same breath, you know, we know as a viewer what happens next and what this achievement is used for and what it was always intended to be used for. So it's also so disturbing and gross to feel proud and elated by this, because ultimately, yeah, they've just successfully designed a bomb that they will now use. And, you know, we know what happens next. Which, a good lead on from that is the scene in the hall after the bomb was dropped. That really stress-inducing, awful scene of Oppenheimer. Clearly the guilt is starting to get to him. I think it's him finally registering what the consequences are of what they have created. It, you know, everyone being so excited feels so truly disturbing in that moment. And being trapped in Oppenheimer, having this panic now at realising what this is, even though, and we'll talk about it at length later, about how he surely knew and understood these consequences earlier on. But during the scene is the first time where we truly see that. And also I do think it's quite interesting at this point to watch him still have to act as the leader of these people, while also he's clearly struggling with his own moral quandaries at this point. And then also the final scene I will just like highlight individually is the closing sequence of Oppenheimer with Albert Einstein talking at the lake. And obviously we finally, after seeing bits and pieces of this scene all throughout the film from Strauss's perspective and seeing the beginning of that kind of conversation, finally seeing what actually caused that horrific dread on both of Oppenheimer and Einstein's faces is truly, you know, that sums up the film. The idea of this never-ending chain reaction, which again I will talk about later in the video, is a truly horrifying moment, and to watch it play out, to know that now they are in the Cold War and the arms race against the Soviets, and that now the development of such dangerous weapons is just happening at this incredibly fast rate, because everyone is so determined to have the most of this. And in a way, in order to avoid danger, yet that only increases the danger. Oppenheimer has fully come to terms with the fact that his actions have directly caused something that cannot end. There's no true end point other than endless destruction. Okay, so now I want to get into my broader commentary around the film, not just like why I love it and the scenes I think are incredible and all of those things, but really first want to look at Oppenheimer as a figure and his moral quandaries and his level of understanding, and whether he was just ignorant or just chose to, whether he truly didn't understand the consequences, whether he was just truly obsessed with quantum mechanics and technological development, and that caused him to be so blinded to the consequences of this, or whether he just was willfully so. So I'm really, I know it's a lot for this because I wrote this out while watching it. But so clearly the film implies that Oppenheimer feels an immense amount of guilt for this, for the development of the bomb. Actually, no, I don't even think it's guilt over the development, because I think he was clearly a supporter, but guilt around the fact that it was used. I think at one point at least in Oppenheimer's mind it was about designing and building the bomb to act as a threat that they would not act on. But of course ultimately those who were responsible for building this were not in control of its use. And that was never going to be the case. If you are designing and building something for the United States military and government, obviously you as a physicist have no power whatsoever. And I truly do not believe that Oppenheimer was dumb enough to not have that understanding earlier, to not reach that conclusion until they had already built it and then realize that he had no control over its use. That was abundantly clear to any person who has just like any kind of understanding of how these systems work. But so obviously we are shown all these instances where he clearly feels guilty. Obviously that scene in the hall after the bombs are dropped and he's trying to like make jokes, but he's having that panic and that dread, and he's having the visions of its effects, and this, he's very clearly been hit with the reality of what this is, of what it means to drop an atomic bomb on 2 cities of innocent people and, you know, burn them to death, essentially. I also do think another interesting scene where we start to see Oppenheimer's guilt, or at least, you know, as implied by the film, is the scene with President Truman, which, I mean, again, really shows what the United States government is as an institution. You know, for them, committing mass murder is nothing out of the ordinary. It doesn't register as wrong because they see it as bringing the troops home or whatever, without those same moral issues with this, versus Oppenheimer, who clearly was suffering guilt from the moral issues of dropping a bomb on civilians, or on anyone for that matter. So I think from that point onwards, we see Oppenheimer, I do think after the bombs dropped, it is clear that he does not want that kind of technology to be developed further. He uses his father of the bomb persona, you know, this persona that's kind of given to him afterwards. He's like celebrated by these people around him for, you know, developing this weapon. He uses this persona to influence policy because he very clearly, I'd say, does not want the hydrogen bomb to be developed. It becomes very clear that he does not want to pursue the development of any more of these kinds of weapons. I think for him, he kind of makes it clear that the atomic bomb is bad enough, why do we need a bigger one? I think it's really interesting, that scene of like the AEC meeting that we cut in and out of all throughout the film, of them looking at a map and circling targets and saying how many aren't big enough. Because an H-bomb would do so much damage, it can only be used on a massive target. That also means it is killing an even more unimaginable number of people. Yeah, I also do think too, like, the arms race is such an interesting time of American policy, because the anti-communist propaganda machine is running in full force, and so is the arms race. And I think through Oppenheimer we see the real lack of humanity and being so determined to build weapons just as in case, to show that we are the threat so that we can't be threatened, essentially. But ultimately that only leads to more danger overall, and this constant cycle of pushing further and further towards danger. And so I do think it also is part of Oppenheimer's arguments against the development of the H-bomb. I think this is probably the point where he starts to have that thought of the never-ending chain reaction and the consequences of developing a bomb like this, developing a weapon like this, and seeing how now you cannot stop this from going further. And also we see him openly discuss the concept of mutually assured destruction which again is like, if both of these powers, being the United States and the Soviet Union, keep building more and more weapons that are bigger and more dangerous, are going to absolutely decimate people and cities, and eventually, could cause just a nuclear holocaust. Obviously, there's no real end to that. Now, there is also another point I want to talk about for Oppenheimer's opposition to the further development of the hydrogen bomb, which is whether his ego played a role in the grip he attempted to keep on the bomb and the development of further technology. Because one thing we clearly see in Oppenheimer is that he is very egotistical, as it seems to be the case with lots of people with these great minds and who receive this kind of endless praise, is that they are very egocentric. And so I do think it's interesting whether Oppenheimer was trying to maintain control over this development because he wanted to be the man who invented the most important weapon, and whether that is also a part of his arguments, is, that's part of his motivations, is that he wants to be the man known for developing the worst thing, but if other people now develop something that is even worse, he is no longer the most powerful man who invented the worst thing. And I do think we also are forced to consider this further when Strauss raises the question of whether Oppenheimer would do it again, whether he would go through building Los Alamos and developing the bomb and going through the Trinity test and doing all of these things, whether he would do it all over again so he could be known as the man who invented the thing, who had so much power and could cause so much destruction through his intellect and skill in developing a weapon. And in addition to that, Strauss, I think, says the line, he wanted to be known for Trinity, but not for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think that line really does raise so many more questions, because at this point we've seen a lot more of Oppenheimer's personal perspective and how all of his arguments are because of his guilt and his morals. His real moral quandaries with designing and dropping bombs like this. But there's at no point in the development where, even when he seems to start questioning about the dropping of the bomb being acceptable, does he ever consider that developing it in the first place is unacceptable. So I do think that line is probably correct, that J. Robert Oppenheimer wanted to be known for the Trinity test, for being able to get all of these incredible minds together to develop the atomic bomb, to drop it to show that it works, but then to not be known for the fact that it was used on innocent civilians and caused mass murder, and it still had all these long-lasting consequences, because ultimately you cannot justify Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's no moral way to do so. But I suppose for Oppenheimer, there is a way to justify the Trinity test and Los Alamos and everything that happened there in this development, whereas there is absolutely no way to justify dropping the atomic bombs on civilians. So another part of Oppenheimer as a figure that we do have to analyse is the nuances of anti-communist propaganda at the time, and how this was used to villainize Oppenheimer once he started to oppose the development of the H-bomb and its program and all of those things. Because obviously, this whole period of time, even throughout World War II, is that despite the fact that the main threat, the thing that they are fighting are the Nazis, the entire time the US government constantly is still talking about the Soviets as a threat. Despite that being their ally during that time, they ultimately know that afterwards that is their enemy, or at least that's what they believe. And that is due to their fear of communism spreading and the idea that they could increase the sphere of influence. But so, obviously, lots of what happens in kind of the third act in that like courtroom-esque sequence, I suppose, is a lot of equating disagreeing with things that are morally wrong as being communist. Obviously, like, they take issue with Oppenheimer donating during the Spanish Civil War and his clear support of labour unions earlier on. We see that at one point, like, him and the other physicists at the time trying to unionise the lab. So obviously, anything that was seen as even remotely leftist was seen as incredibly negative, and to the US government they believed it to be dangerous and a direct threat to their safety, which obviously, yeah, that's up for debate, I suppose. I don't agree. But so obviously we start to really, I think, empathise with Oppenheimer a lot during that period of time, because there are things that he is clearly innocent of that they still are trying to hold him responsible for, simply because he does not want to develop further weapons. This refusal to support the H-bomb development is seen as a direct threat to the US and seen as like a support for the Soviets. It's him refusing to support the arms race, essentially. You know, he's refusing to help them continue this, again, never-ending chain reaction following the development of the atomic bomb and using the atomic bomb. So you do start to feel empathy for him, because you understand that there are injustices occurring during that investigation, which is very clearly, you know, rigged in a certain direction. Essentially, as soon as he's offering to lay out his whole life, which of course includes him being tied to people who were Communist Party members and openly progressive, and also he was clearly progressive. He said how he was very open to a variety of ideas, and you could count that as probably being a veiled way of saying he's a progressive. As an audience, we're empathising with that because we can see the injustices of that as well. I also do think it's interesting and probably something to consider whether Oppenheimer put himself through the investigation in an attempt to absolve himself of guilt for the bombs. You know, whether he can lay himself out like this and let himself be torn to shreds, that his whole life essentially be dissected in this way in order for him to say, I'm not guilty anymore. It allows him to be absolved. And Cassie mentions that, you know, towards the end she says, did you think if they tar and feather you that this would be okay, essentially? I can't remember like the rest of that line, but she essentially says, like, did you think if you let them tear into you in this way and dissect every part of your life that you wouldn't be the bad guy anymore for doing this, for designing this weapon, for building it, for being responsible for it existing? And I do think that there's a very important and interesting thing to consider for Oppenheimer, because I think it is clear that he did feel guilt. I think it'd be impossible, and he would have to be bordering on sociopathic to not feel any guilt about this. Again, I do think it's probably more guilt that the bombs were used and less that he built it. But either way, him attempting to absolve himself in this way by letting everyone else destroy him in many senses, I think, you know, was that effective? I think that, you know, that's a question we could still ask. I also do wonder as well if he thought that he would make it out of that investigation and still be okay and still be able to hold on to his power in the scientific community and be able to still have a hold on further arms development. Like, whether any part of him that believed that he could make it out of the other side of that investigation and still hold the power that he did beforehand among these people. Because there is a clear point in which he's trying to hold on to power of the development of weapons, because I think that, that is what he ends up dedicating his life to, essentially. Because while initially he wanted to dedicate his life to quantum mechanics, and that was a newer science, it was a newer aspect of physics, he essentially was creative with bringing it to America. So obviously he, at the time, was invested in that development because that was his passion and he's truly interested in it, clearly very skilled in it. But ultimately all of those things only led to the development of the bomb. It's about the hold he's trying to have over these things. He's trying to keep his hold over this development, because this is ultimately everything he's worked towards, even if in the beginning he didn't realise that this was the end point that he was working to. I also do think a big thing we have to question about Oppenheimer as a figure is how we can both empathise with him on account of his guilt, yet also question his level of awareness in regards to the consequences of designing the atomic bomb. Now, I've already talked about this kind of in and out all throughout the video, but at a more singular point here, he acts as though the consequences weren't apparent until after the bombs were dropped, yet he was far too intelligent to be unaware that this would be what would happen. You cannot tell me that during the entire time at Los Alamos that Robert Oppenheimer was not aware that designing a bomb would eventually cause it to be dropped on people and kill them. There is absolutely no way he did not understand that that was the point they were hurtling towards every time their development improved. I don't know whether he was, again, so blinded by it as a development that he just was willfully ignorant of the consequences, or whether he truly just, I don't know, he just didn't think about it. But again, I just think he was too intelligent to not understand where this was heading. I wrote down, was he too caught up in beating the Nazis to consider the consequences? Because obviously originally they're in a race against the Nazis to design a bomb, because the Nazis had a bunch of physicists and those who specialise in quantum mechanics developing a bomb ahead of the US starting, versus obviously Oppenheimer and his team. And so whether it was about this fight to develop it first, so they had the threat and he wasn't considering whether they would actually use it, because against the Nazis, we'll never know if they would actually have dropped a bomb on Nazi Germany, if they would have dropped some there. We don't know what that version is, if they had developed it before Hitler had died and the war had ended. But that is something we have to question during that phase at Los Alamos, and all the way up until the war in Germany has ended and they're only fighting in the Pacific. We can, I suppose, consider whether Oppenheimer was just so hyper-focused on this race against the Nazis that he didn't consider what the after looked like. And because the after of beating the Nazis in development would have looked very different, maybe not wildly different, but it might have just looked different location-wise to what we saw, or it could have been vastly different, because dropping a bomb in the middle of Europe, I imagine, looks different to dropping bombs in Japan for United States government at this time, considering, their treatment of a Western nation is always going to be different. There's also the idea of whether Oppenheimer was blinded by his obsession with further development in quantum mechanics and technology, whether he was just so hyper-fixated on development of these things that he, again, didn't consider the consequences. There's all these points where we are really sitting there asking ourselves, was he just truly not considering consequences because he was so laser focused on the goal of developing the bomb but at the same time he's developing a weapon. You cannot ignore the consequences when you are developing something that is only made to commit mass destruction. So now my further questions are, can we attempt to absolve him despite the destruction his work caused and the endless repercussions? For me, we cannot absolve J. Robert Oppenheimer. Whether he felt guilty or not, whether he had moral quandaries or not, whether he was willfully ignorant or genuinely didn't consider the consequences for whatever reason, there is at no point that we can absolve him. You know, whether he intended it or not, whether he really thought they would just design a bomb and it wouldn't be used, or whether he fully understood that after designing this bomb they would use it. Either way, he is responsible for the atomic bomb existing. He is responsible for so many people dying. And not even just that, but the after. Because the arms race is ultimately fueled by both the Soviets and the United States attempting to develop bigger, more dangerous weapons after the atomic bomb. So there is, in my opinion, absolutely no way to absolve Oppenheimer, nor should there even really be an attempt to do so, because, again, whether he had moral issues with it or not, whether if later on in his life he was against it or not, he still caused this, and that's it, really. And, you know, to further that, can his work at Los Alamos be justified, both in terms of it being used against Nazis or the Japanese? Because, again, I guess we do have to consider at one point that this was to be used against Nazi Germany. You know, can we justify this? Because I suppose the only question of whether we could justify the work at Los Alamos was if the Nazis did build an atomic bomb first, would they have used it? Would Hitler have ordered for it to be dropped if they had been the ones to reach that point first? And I do think that that is maybe the only way we can justify any of it, is the idea that, you know, and this is what Oppenheimer and all of those people believed at the time, was that if we don't get there first, the Nazis will, and they are more dangerous than us, and that was the opinion they held. So it's about whether, if we view it through that lens, can we justify it only on that level? But even then, I think that, you know, it's a very difficult question to ask, because yeah, I think the Nazis having it may have been worse, but then at the same time we saw what happened when the United States were the ones to have it, and they ultimately used it against the Japanese, which was completely unjustified. It was a war they'd already won on that front. They had already won in the Pacific, essentially. But because they felt they needed a definitive end, even though they were already well close enough to it being definitive, you know, we really definitely cannot be justified against the Japanese. Can it be justified that, not even that, can the bomb be justified, but can developing technology to beat the Nazis be justified? And also, I do want to point out one other opinion that Oppenheimer clearly held later in the film, and obviously later in his life, or at least not that much later, but, you know, after the bombs are dropped and Teller mentions to him, like, will you please, like, continue the hydrogen bomb research? 'Cause obviously the entire time Teller was obsessed with that idea. But, you know, Oppenheimer makes the point that he believes that the introduction of nuclear war would make all further war unthinkable. So it's almost like, in his mind, the way he justified it was, us doing this once makes the threat too great that we wouldn't even consider a war at all after this. That there is at no point that we would even think to do this. That we would think to have conflict on this scale again, because now we have something that, you know, if used by both sides, would cause complete destruction. At that point, it almost is, yeah, you do think all war is unthinkable if this is what we're using in a war. But then, as we've seen, war has not ended since World War II. It did not end after, all war in the world did not end after the atomic bombs were dropped. And I think to have believed that is probably a little delusional. But I also don't understand at the time, because it does feel unthinkable to have weapons this great, you know, of this magnitude, and to still continue to have conflict like this be an option. And so obviously that leads into the reality of living in a post-Oppenheimer world, in a world after the bombs were dropped. So obviously, I don't really need to say, but obviously the dropping of the bombs was horrific. Truly inhumane, it's disturbing, it's disgusting, it is one of the worst, just one of the worst things that, you know, has ever been done to people. To, you know, essentially just burn them to death in that way. The radiation, the after effects, because it's not like the bombs are dropped and it killed people and that was it. People still, even now, have effects from the radiation. You know, those places will forever be impacted by, you know, dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's just, I don't really have a lot to say, because I think we can all understand that dropping those bombs was truly fucking horrific. And there's nothing else to be said there. And also, now we're living in a post-Cold War, post-arms race world. We now live with the constant fear of nuclear warfare, because after the atomic bombs were dropped, it was a race by multiple nations to build up all of these weapons, to have massive amounts of these weapons, and of worse ones, including the H-bomb, you know, even more destructive versions of this. At the time, an idea to make sure that other nations weren't a threat, but now we have, you know, the United States and Russia and China and several other places that all have nuclear weapons that, if used against each other, will destroy everything, and we will live in a nuclear holocaust. And there will be nothing that can solve that. You know, the reality of the post-Oppenheimer world is that we now have to live with the constant fear that one conflict could destroy the world. And that is truly terrifying. And I do think it's the ultimate consequence of that never-ending chain reaction that we'll talk about now, both in its more literal sense and in its more metaphorical one. So obviously in the literal sense, it was early on in the film and early on in the development of the atomic bomb, was Teller doing calculations that so I have to try and remember like the math of it, I suppose, but that the chain reactions that cause the bomb to work could be never ending, and therefore could cause the atmosphere to be set alight. They had this concept of atmospheric ignition, which is that they would just set fire to the atmosphere and destroy the world. And, you know, they becomes, you know, almost a running joke among those physicists of like the chance, you know, because the chances of it happening are near zero. You know, near zero is not zero. So the, you know, minuscule chance that they could destroy everything when they, you know, drop the bomb for the first time at the Trinity test. And, you know, that alone is terrifying. The thought that, you know, it may not end, that literal chain reaction. But then also that never-ending chain reaction becomes like the broad metaphor of the film, I guess, which is that by developing this technology, by building the bomb, by dropping the bombs, our geopolitics have been permanently shaped by those choices, and this, you know, of course, as I've mentioned, turned into, or led to, the arms race, led to the further development of even bigger weapons, even more dangerous weapons, that, you know, during that Cold War period, there was so many of these weapons being built. There's just, you know, the arsenals that these countries have now as a result. You know, we are now in that endless chain reaction of events, that it's not going to end, that the development will continue, the danger will increase, and it's going to keep happening over and over and over again. And, you know, the end conclusion of that reaction is that the world will still be set alight. So ultimately, you know, we face the reality that Oppenheimer's choices could still set the world alight, just as they could have during that test. And that we'll never know that the chance is near zero, but it's still not zero. And that, I think, is the dread that we feel by the end of the film, especially in that final scene. We see Oppenheimer truly recognising what the end point of this is. And it is something that is so, again, truly fucking horrific and terrifying. Anyway, my name's Danae Brazel. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know that it got a bit heavy. I mean, this film is obviously a heavy topic. The subject matter is obviously pretty intense, so I get it, but hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video, and if you'd like to see more from me, you can subscribe. My next video I plan on doing on fellow travellers, same back here, so that will be in a couple of weeks. And if you want to see more of me in general, you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok. I post on Instagram every day, TikTok pretty often as well. I'm a makeup and special effects artist, so that's where all of my work for that is. And it's also where you can keep up with me a little more as well. But yeah, if you enjoy the video, I'm really glad, and yeah, please like and subscribe and all those things. And yeah, I really appreciate you watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.